Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. As always, my name is Ross Edelstein, and I'll be your host. And this week we are talking about transit. Now, I've alluded to it several times throughout this podcast and even done some episodes that touch on areas of it. The travel episode and the paratransit episode. This is going to be sort of a deep dive into the overview of transit, and sort of is more of a part one to that topic. Now, as I said, I've already done paratransit, which does go into this, but we are going to be more focused on general population transit, as opposed to something like paratransit, which is really designed for disabled people as a particular service for that audience. And this is one of the sort of foundational areas of, in particular, the disability rights movement in the United States, which we'll get back to. But on the screen here, we have one of my favorite transit pictures I've ever taken. This is the CTA L, and we have a L train at a station in the loop, and in the background you have the tall sort of various brick and steel buildings of downtown Chicago, a lot of people on the tracks, and then a L train coming into the station. Now, this is a station with sort of, the best way I can describe it is renderite. You have the sort of white, wavy, architectural looking platform canopies over the high level boarding platform, a throng of people on the left on that platform behind the blue detectable warnings, and the train itself is the stainless steel L car, except it's one of their Heritage Fleet units. In particular, this is 3149, which was actually chartered for the Illinois Railway Museum on a charter I was on. That being said, let's get into this with story time with Ross. Now, as always, the photo on the screen is me looking extremely angry while driving a train, but I'm actually having the time of my life. That being said, I don't have the biggest story time here. A lot of this is relaying other people's stories. That being said, the reality is that a lot of these same issues persist to this day. And there was actually an incident I had back in December for a CTA holiday train, where the way that they did security for it and had people line up kept disabled people from using it because it would be inconvenient for the people running the show. Now, this is an outlier for the CTA. They are generally actually quite good, but it is an issue, and it is an incident that happened. And a lot of that inconvenience is something that's going to come up again and again during this episode. Now, let's start with a definition of public transit. On the screen, we have a Illinois Railway Museum. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there. Trolley. Now, this is a small trolley, it's open air, and it's basically some benches on a platform with the electric bogies below, and it's coming around a curve with various folks waiting alongside the tracks, including two people who are using scooters to get around, specifically mobility scooters. They're facing away from the trolley and watching other things, but I really like this little thing. It's from Veracruz, Mexico. It is adorable, and well, it is also extremely inaccessible. Mostly because the actual supports that keep the roof up are more or less just wooden beams with spaces between them for people to get up and on. It is a design that would not fly today anywhere. Now, when I say defining public transit, I'm going to generally use the same definition I've been using. As opposed to travel, which is focused on longer distances, public transit generally focuses on the same identified region. And what that can mean does vary from place to place. But that means anything from, say, your Northeast Regionals, which are a public transit that is also technically intercity trains. But it also means things like your streetcars and trolleys and your buses, and we'll get into buses as well. And generally, they're focused on that same day trip. So, for example, getting to work, getting home, going to the doctor's office, going to the store, etc. Oftentimes, public transit will have multiple departures each day for the system. So you're going to have, say, frequencies that are, this comes every 15 minutes, as opposed to a train shows up at 8 a.m. and then 12:30 and then 4:52 or whatever. Because the focus is on getting you around the area or to and from your destination in that same day. These are also often subsidized by the government. Now, travel can also be subsidized by the government, directly or indirectly. For example, a lot of airports are owned by government entities or semi-government entities, which basically means that instead of, say, American Airlines owning the airport, they're just using it, which takes a lot of the cost burden off of a particular airline. Or it can be like Amtrak, where the federal government, while they should be less focused on them being run profitably, the federal government does give subsidies to help support Amtrak's operations. That being said, public transit is generally owned by or heavily subsidized and regulated by government agencies. And generally, at least in the US context, it is either a specific agency or it's an authority, which is essentially the government at the state or local level, or sometimes the national level, creating a not quite actually owned by the government, like, say, a city or state department, but also still controlled by and run by the government, which has its own taxing and regulatory abilities for that specific purpose. New York City's subway line is a great example where those authorities basically took over a lot of those systems, and we'll get more into that in a moment. That being said, let's talk about the general history up to 1945. And part of why I say up to 1945 here is that after World War II, there are some major changes in both disability thought and public transit that sort of lead to where we are today. Now, on the screen in front of you, we have a picture of the North Chicago Street Railroad number 8, which is a 1859 horse-drawn streetcar from the Illinois Railway Museum. Now, it's currently in a barn in this photo, and it's a very short rail car, and it has, I believe, like 6 rows of 4 people. So not a very high capacity. It actually says 18 seats, so that's about what I was thinking. And on the sign, it says that its power is hay and oats, and it was pulled by two horses. The reason that I have this here is that a lot of early public transportation was as far back as the pre-railroad era. Now, a lot of railroads were the first public transit, but a lot of particularly these omnibuses, which are essentially horse-drawn rail cars, were the public transit that first came about. Really, most of the world. Now, with a lot of these early public transit systems, they were privately owned, and this continued for a very long time, and is one of the core bits of public transit getting to the way it is today. Now, when you have a privately owned public transportation network, you essentially have a couple things that you have to do to make it profitable. One, run it as a loss leader for other things. Now, Brightline in Florida is a great example of this, where it's actually lost money. Now, some of that is from refinancing debts and so on, but the people who own Brightline are property developers first and railroaders second. It's a spin-off of the actual railroad that Brightline runs on, more or less. And for a lot of public transportation, owning the place that you're sending people to and then giving them a way to get around, that's more of a way to make it attractive, as opposed to this is why we're making the public transportation, that is. Now, when you are a private entity, you need to make money. Your whole point is to basically make money and be profitable. And for a lot of public transportation, this can mean any number of things. One, what are you considering profitable? Is it your real estate, or is it your actual operation? But it also means you might have higher fares because you are responsible for getting every penny you get. It also means that you're going to be less willing to spend money on things that do not get you the greatest bang for your buck. Now, we'll talk about this in a bit, but keep that in mind, especially as you start to have the later end of the sort of early years of public transit turn into the post-Civil War era in the United States. Now, prior to this, particularly with railroads, it's kind of open season on anybody can do whatever they want. You can do all kinds of scams. See the first Transcontinental Railroad, which was a bunch of land companies that happened to be building a railroad. And lo and behold, those land companies really made most of their money off those land sales. That being said, in the sort of end of Reconstruction, start of the Gilded Age, and into the Progressive Era in the United States, sort of your 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, you start to get this idea of public goods. Now, this is looking at organizations that create a public good, and there are a number of types of these things. And in a lot of cases, they have what is known as a natural monopoly. While you can build multiple rail lines right next to each other, and it did happen, in a lot of cases, it doesn't make sense to. In the same way that, well, I want to make power for the city. You're not going to have 10 different boutique generating companies all generating different electricity, and then people go in and choose. That doesn't necessarily make sense to do, because what it ends up doing is what's known as destructive competition. which we'll come back to in a moment. Now, a lot of these public goods were then regulated by both local agencies through a number of methods, as well as state and federal companies. The original Surface Transportation Board, not Surface Transportation Board, Interstate Commerce Commission regulated railroads for a long time, and that included a lot of what now we consider commuter rail as public transit. But this regulation was, in essence, to try to make it so that, especially with these natural monopolies of public goods, they weren't taking advantage of people. Now, we'll come back to this in a bit with this sort of regulation, but this was anything from, say, giving the contract for the streetcar or interurban to a company and then having them have to maintain the roads, because at the end of the day, the streetcar is more likely to cause damage, or at least that was the theory. And it also means that you're limiting in these contracts, because oftentimes public transportation, especially things like streetcars and interurbans in that sort of boom period around that sort of 1890 through 1910, a lot of those were chartered, which basically means, okay, we are giving you the rights to build on this bit of land and have the special authority of this agency. The same with early buses and transportation of that nature. Now, as I mentioned, one of the reasons this was done was to avoid destructive competition. Now, let's say you have a railroad line and it's serving a suburb of a city. Now, you aren't going to necessarily have somebody coming in and building the second line that is only slightly different and serves most of the same stops and areas to that suburb without the two companies getting into essentially a race to the bottom, because they need to have a reason for people to use that system, and their system in particular, and that often leads to the sort of destructive competition that, say, when you have a lot of railroad lines duplicating each other in places like the Midwest, as a great example, where it was kind of a free-for-all between the big railroad companies up until the 1920s, more or less. But that destructive competition often means that public goods that are needed, say the train and how you get to work and to school and so on, that ends up falling apart. So the idea is that, well, we can have constructive competition by limiting the number of agencies that exist, as well as keeping a tight regulatory structure on them, which is good in theory, up until you have the Great Depression and World War II. Now, I'll also give a quick shout out to World War I, when, because the railroads were essentially so lax on actually doing what they were being paid to by the government for getting, say, troops and war material around, that the government essentially just nationalized them outright for the war. You have a sort of post-war, and in particular during the Roaring '20s, sort of situation where the railroad companies are your gold-printed moneymaker. You've had a lot of, in particular, the less profitable lines go bust naturally, and then you have the sort of big stress test. Now, keep in mind that the Great Depression is going to be probably an episode in and of itself, especially since a lot of disability rights and the sort of first proto stages of some of those very earliest ways of thinking about disability come about during that period. But the Great Depression sort of triggers a lot of railroad companies to not be able to put money into their systems. This also means that because there's a lot of people out of work, a lot of those other forms of transit, such as bus systems or local streetcar lines, those tend to go under. And then immediately out of the Great Depression, you have World War II, where suddenly there's a lot of money flowing from the government into railroads, and a lot of these same railroad executives, and to a lesser extent public transportation executives, remember what happened in World War I. And so they're really pushing to do what the government needs to the detriment of essentially the physical state of their systems. Now, this means that sort of by the end of it, you have, especially since a lot of these contracts were taken with less return than what they might have done outside of the war. Because of all of this, you have railroads that have basically used everything to an inch of its life without the money to fix it. And really, this means that a lot of public transit in the US is struggling. Now, we will get back into this in a couple of slides, but I want to talk about disability in the US up to that same point of sort of the war's over. Now, I believe this photo is a little bit later, but this is Central State Hospital in Indianapolis. You have a large, imposing, sort of Victorian-styled building in the background on a sort of circle lawn, big monumental, looks almost more like a hotel. And you have a bunch of 1950s or late 40s cars, pretty sure it's the 50s, on the Circle Drive in front of it. This is an asylum. Central State was an asylum and is currently the home of the Medical History Museum in Indianapolis, which I do recommend you go to. It's actually one of the better ones that interprets that history. Now, in the sort of period up until 1945, disability in the US was heavily reliant on the medical model. Now, for a quick refresher, disability under the medical model is something that is inherently wrong with a person and needs to be fixed. Good example, somebody who can't use stairs in a building, well, it's because they have a disability that prevents them from using the stairs, and we need to figure out why they can't use the stairs and fix that in the person. Now, this model, and in particular the way that disability was handled in the US and really a lot of the world, is the idea of the asylum or the quote-unquote schools for the deaf and blind. These were residential treatment centers, more or less. And treatment I use relatively loosely. This meant that people lived there full time, and these institutions were essentially, the state pays for the care of this group more or less because they're seen as a burden to the public. And so what often ends up happening is that these were really abusive places. Part of this also comes from the fact that segregation was alive and well, and in a lot of cases, this is also segregation of disabled people. Now, the US is mostly known for the racial segregation, things like separate but equal, which is important to remember for this context as well. And the US did do that. But what's often less known and remembered is that segregation was also very much a thing for disabled people. Now, in the US, we had what were known as ugly laws. Essentially, it would be places saying, well, if you are ugly, quote unquote, and a lot of this meant things like being homeless, having any sort of visible disability. In some cases, you could be the most attractive person in the world, but just using a wheelchair would get you cited under an ugly law. These basically said you can't exist in public if you fit outside of the accepted definitions of what is acceptable. And the last of these were on the books, explicitly saying disabled people are not allowed to participate in public until 1970s. In fact, it wasn't, I believe, until 1974 that the last one was out. So the way that it was really thought about is out of sight, out of mind. You have this idea that, well, we don't want the general public to have to experience these icky disabled people, so we're just going to push them somewhere else, and that'll be fine. That doesn't really work. And what really starts to cause the strain on this is the Great Depression. Because one of the things about the Great Depression is that a lot of care for especially people who had disabilities that were gained, things like I'm a farmer and lost my arm, a lot of that care was done in family units. Well, the thing is, a lot of people lost their jobs and their ability to provide for others, and in particular, a lot of the work that could accommodate disabled people on things like farms kind of dries up during the Dust Bowl. No pun actually intended there. So you also have the idea of a lot of people who basically end up losing everything, and for whatever reason, for example, getting a disability in life, not being able to provide for their families, that ends up with Social Security coming about and the sort of first ideas of the social safety net that's not just let's take the disabled people and stick them away from the public eye. And that starts to ramp up in the post-World War II era, which is incredibly important to remember that World War II is the sort of ending of this point. But because of the way we propagandized World War II as this sort of righteous liberation campaign, and in particular also provided a lot of incentives under things like the GI Bill, which was and is a law that provides things like healthcare and education and other opportunities to folks who serve in the U.S. Army. A lot of that led to, particularly with service-related injuries, disabled people not necessarily being seen as an other in the same way anymore. And actually, you can see this happening elsewhere in the world. For example, Russia having their particular model of disability that comes in the post-World War II era of, did you fight on the Eastern Front against the Nazis and get a disability there? Okay, we'll give you supports. Whereas if you weren't that, there was a whole lot less available for you. But this really starts to drive that awareness. And in the post-war era, we start to see the first steps towards accessible transit. Now, this is a photo, and I will have the link to this and a lot of my other sources, as I did a good bit of research here, and a lot of it is primary sources that I gathered from various folks. And I'll also be linking Crip Camp because it was a central part of, well, really that fight for 504 and beyond had a lot to do with this topic. That being said, the first steps in accessible transit were almost entirely private entities. Things like care homes or rehabilitation centers, things like that privately offered accessible ways to get around. And on the screen here, we actually see some of that I mentioned with the University of Illinois. It was one of the first universities to actually take the time to say, hey, disabled people have a right to be educated. And so we're going to take the time to have things like a bus with a wheelchair lift so that our disabled students can get to and from the school and actually participate on that equitable level. What this ends up doing with a lot of these early ways of thinking means that a lot of that early transit was not necessarily public transit in the sense that it wasn't for just the general population to use. So while the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana is a public entity, if you weren't a part of the student body, you weren't necessarily benefiting from the accessible buses they might have had, or the fact that they put actual effort into making an accessible campus. And this is also where a lot of the early organization for accessible transit starts to form around, especially these early universities that are actually putting energy into it. University of California, San Francisco is another great example of this that we will come back to. That being said, let's talk about nationalization. Now, on the screen, the photo I have is of a lime greenish hopper car. I don't know the best way to describe it. And it's in a barn at a railroad museum, the Pennsylvania State Railroad Museum. Now, you might be thinking, Ross, why do you have a hopper car in the public transit episode as the main photo of a slide? And it's because of nationalization and the fact that the people who owned it, Penn Central, are a lot of how public transit became what it is today as mostly government or quasi-government agencies. And on this hopper car, you have what is known as the mating worms, which is the stylized P and stylized C, very 60s, that also are supposed to be like a railroad coupler, so they're kind of grabbing onto each other at the same time. But they really look like worms that are cuddling or something. It's an interesting design choice. But the Penn Central, and there is a great episode of the Well, There's Your Problem podcast on this, and by episode I mean 3. Now, Penn Central is the epitome of the fall of the privately owned public transportation company. Now, we still have some of those today, particularly with buses and planes, but buses and planes, usually when they're privately owned, are long distance. So when we're talking about public transit, a lot of these private companies, and this also leads into things like Amtrak, as we'll get to, but a lot of these private companies really were struggling after the war. It leads to a lot of ways that they're trying to figure out, how do we make it so that we're profitable again? Because again, at this point it was pretty well established that the point of a public company is to make money. And so if they are not making enough money, well, that puts people in trouble and leads to potential bankruptcy. So it's things like cooking the books. Oh, it's not our giant coal trains that are causing us track issues. It's our rather light passenger trains, or doing creative accounting to make you look like you're doing well in order to sell more shares, get more loans, whatever. Again, watch the Penn Central episode of Well, There's Your Problem, particularly the first couple, but all of them are actually very relevant. The other part is that a lot of regulation wasn't meeting modernity. Now, we can look at interurbans and streetcars for a lot of this. A lot of the times you would have a contract signed for 20, 30, 40, 50 years for these kinds of transit. Same with buses. And oftentimes, the fare that you could charge wasn't tied to inflation. So what that means is that your income is going to stay the same, especially when you're looking at a lot of smaller places. Gary is a great example of this, where you're charging, say, 25 cents to get on the train, but that ride is now costing you 30 cents. When you originally signed it, it cost you 10 cents. So now you're losing money with everybody getting on, and because of the contract and regulations, you are not allowed to ask for more money. It also did things like setting what you can charge for fares, and also in a lot of cases required certain routes to be ran for passenger service. That was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was a regulatory body that previously had done the regulation of railroads in particular. Now, this often meant that in the sort of last days of privately owned public transit, you'd get things like one-car trains serving a route. Because essentially, you couldn't afford to run the even longer train. That and demand changes. Again, that is a whole other topic. But the arrival of cars, in particular for getting around your city, led to a lot of public transit falling out of use. A lot of the streetcar suburbs where interurbans previously had been really the way of getting around, suddenly there is no more need for that interurban, because if you're close enough to take the train, especially the interurbans, well, you're close enough to actually take the actual car that you own into the city, and then you don't have to deal with other people, and it's seen as more pleasant, especially with a lot of the car-focused propaganda of that period. Again, this is a whole other conversation on where these financial worries come from. This is the shortest version I can do and do it any sort of justice. That being said, this leads to ideas of how do we make this work. And so this leads to a lot of mergers of various, particularly railroad companies, but also a lot of private public transportation companies running buses and trains, particularly streetcars. Now, these mergers sort of start happening much earlier than the post-war era. Great example is the Chicago surface lines that started running all the streetcars in Chicago in 1913 because, as I mentioned, you have a lot of competing routes because there are only so many places in Chicago that exist. And so a lot of trains are going the same place. Might as well combine them. That does lead to better efficiency. The problem is that a lot of these mergers led to the argument that, well, we had two competing lines, we can close them down, right? And in a lot of cases, these competing lines don't serve the same places at the public transit level. For example, you have in Indiana the old Monon route, which comes in from the north and west, from Chicago. And then you have the nickel plate line that was parallel to it for a lot of the city, but did sort of verge off and serve a completely different area. This essentially leads to, if the same company owns both of them, well, these are both serving outside of the city. We don't really need this. They go to the Interstate Commerce Commission and say, hey, can we close these? And generally they'll get a yes. Penn Central takes this to the max because, again, while there was a bit of a gentleman's agreement between the original companies, the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central Railroad, for the Northeast of who owns what, the Penn Central, now those companies did not have that same handshake west of the Appalachians. And so there's a lot of, quite literally, the same exact line being explicitly duplicated. This also leads to a lot of the mergers that do end up getting approved, because at this time they had to be approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. These mergers that did end up going through, again, watch the Penn Central series from Well, There's a Problem, goes into all of this a lot more detail. But these mergers essentially lead to less strong railroads for some of them. And in a lot of cases, for the ones that didn't merge, that were in similar straits, eventually this leads to bankruptcy as well, and being bought up by other railroads. Now, this leads to a potential loss of a lot of transit. And what that ends up meaning is that cities and states take up the gap. It's not until Amtrak is put together in, I forget what year it is, 72, I think. It was 1971, I just looked it up. But it's not until that point that the federal government is willing to do anything. And what that ends up meaning is that a lot of that early burden of, particularly in the 50s and 60s, of, well, the private companies don't want to run this anymore, they've been told that they can drop the line, but the actual people living there still need to get around, that ends up being taken up by city and state agencies. And what that means is that now the government, or a basically specifically designated, not quite run by the government, but owned by the government agency, is in charge of public transit instead of these private firms. And again, this is a hugely complicated area of this particular story. But it's also incredibly important for understanding how we got to this point when we're talking about why is public transit the way it is. That being said, before we get back into the disability side of things, let's get a word from our sponsors. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Thank you, Ross of the Midroll. Now, let's talk about a big, meaty concept that is really important for understanding how public transit and the disability rights movement really aligned. Independent living. Now, in disability, independent living is kind of what it says on the tin, where it's the concept that disabled people should be able to live life with the same opportunity to make decisions about their life as others. This is more or less looking at how do we actually make it so that disabled people can choose where they live, where they work, where they go to school, how do you get there, who can you spend time with, what do you do in your free time. This is essentially an idea that instead of, as I mentioned, asylums and segregation, disabled people should have the same rights as everyone else, to have these same experiences. Now, this might sound like we're more or less giving people an equal chance, and yes. That said, it's actually more about equity. Now, when we're talking about having the same opportunities when you're disabled to do things, this is essentially saying addressing those barriers that get in the way of you being able to make those choices. This includes addressing things like systemic ableism, or the fact that a lot of schools prior to special education and Section 504 basically weren't willing to do anything for disabled people, period. And this, more or less, leads to how disability rights is really focused on providing that equitable experience as an idea. Because again, it's the idea that discrimination exists and that being able to live independently is basically living in a world where the discrimination that you face has been mitigated to the point where you have the same opportunity as everyone else. Now, every major city has at least one center for independent living, and there are also a complete slate of things called independent living services that help you address things like, how do I get around this city? How do I find housing? How do I find a job? How do I make sure that I am on that equal, equitable playing field? And independent living sort of starts up in this same period. Highly recommend watching Crip Camp for more on this, and I will do a independent living episode later on, but really remembering that a lot of these areas are highly related to transit is incredibly important, because if you can't get to and from your job, your house, the grocery store, school, hanging out with friends, you're not really going to be independently living. Because the core concept is that everybody should be able to do this on their own with no interference from outside sources, at least to the highest practicable amount. And again, that's going to be another episode, but let's talk about Bart. And no, I'm not talking about The Simpsons. Now, on the screen, we have a very 1970s looking picture. It is a Bay Area Rapid Transit rail car, or BART, that has two people in it. On the left, we have a man looking in his mid-30s, early 40s, wearing glasses and a suit in a wheelchair. And on the right, sitting on what looks to be like a leather couch that you would find in someone's living room. Again, very 1970s. You have a young boy with a very large pin who has crutches. And you also have wood grain paneling on a lot of the panels in this car. It just feels like the 1970s in this photo. It's also a black and white photo. The man in the picture is one of the most important people for understanding disability in public transit, Harold Wilson. We'll come back to him in a moment, but independent living really had a lot with public transit, especially in places like Chicago, New York City, San Francisco, to an extent LA, but really everywhere. And we'll come back to this in a couple slides. But a core part of what centers for independent living do is transit access. Because again, you can't do any of the choices that you want to make for yourself with no freedom of movement. And I will link both the various sources I've used, including the sort of background one that best describes this story, but also the document that I have cited before that shows that disabled people usually are reliant on other people to get around. But one of the earliest fights on the road to 504 was around public transit. Because at the end of the day, the independent living movement really led to a lot of 504. So San Francisco really became one of the hubs for the disability rights movement due to, in particular, Harold Wilson and his advocacy to push for BART to be accessible. Basically, Wilson had a spinal injury and started advocating from that point on. That being said, his advocacy was pretty different than some of the other advocacy we saw. Now, San Francisco and California more broadly during this time period had already shifted to more of the independent living movement. There was a lot of work being done, particularly in San Francisco on this, to address things like asyla. This is also around the time when you first start to see some of the abuses of asylums come out, especially after JFK and all the work he did on developmental disabilities. Go to my episode on the Kennedys for that. But the big thing to remember is that this was an area that was ripe for this early work. And a lot of rapid transit, like BART, is actually ideal for making it accessible in that physical sense. Think of it this way. The train only goes one way or another. You have a lot of the infrastructure as something that is permanent and also requires you to build things. Unlike, say, a bus stop, which can literally just be grass in the middle of nowhere. A lot of things like metros, subways, BART, which is kind of none of the above. Classifications for transit are weird, but things like BART that are this sort of public transit system often have the ability to do level boarding, which I will do a future episode on various forms of transit and maybe even particular systems and their accessibility. But BART in particular, and other subways and metros like it, they already have the ability to do what is known as level boarding, because they control all of those infrastructure things, and you can build it so that the train sits above the actual platform or at the same level as it, which eliminates the need to step onto the train. Now, there will still be barriers, things like platform gaps between the actual door and the platform, which can be solved because you generally know where the train is going. And especially now, we have ways to actually have fillers. But even when you have level boarding, you still have to address things like, how do we get people into the station? What if we need to get somebody on the other track, if it's not a station that has just the sort of central platform called an island platform? What about elevators, especially for places that are like New York City or Chicago, or really any place you have grade separated transit? That, plus the culture of San Francisco around disability, led to Harold Wilson being able to catch more flies with honey than vinegar. He was able to basically just call and be the squeaky wheel and convince people on a personal individual level, hey, we should be doing this. This is important. Now, keep in mind, the BART system is what is known as a Great Society metro. Under Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the person who succeeded JFK, one of the big things that was done was invest a lot of money into public transit during that sort of early phase of cities taking over things like the metro systems, a lot of which had been originally built and operated by private companies, and some of which were involved in past stories. That being said, a lot of these Great Society metros were new builds. BART is one of the great examples. The other, that is actually one of the more accessible ones, is the Washington Metro. So you have these relatively newer systems that you're not necessarily having to fight as much to, say, put in elevators, because by that point, elevators were a known commodity. Unlike, say, Boston or Chicago or New York, where a lot of those systems, the construction predates the existence of an elevator that was safe for the public to use. Particularly, that could fit into the small footprint that you really wanted for a station. But also, a lot of these Great Society metros were publicly owned. They had, in many cases, never been privately owned entities. So things like BART had also to answer to the public from day one. So what Wilson could do is, again, make these alliances and push for accessibility in BART. And so the photo on the screen is from 1972. It's from way before anywhere else was required to be accessible. And keep in mind that making this accessible is one of the big wins, and it's what led to the disability rights movement really being able to center itself in San Francisco. Because with independent living, if you can get around, you can participate in things like direct action, organizing with other people, and building that community. It's one of the reasons that public transit hasn't been funded in this country. We'll come back to that. That being said, let's talk about why we're doing this. So on the screen, I have an example of a newer station. This is the relatively recently built Dune Park Station of the South Shoreline. In the background, you have a concrete bridge over the tracks with a diesel locomotive on the far track, sort of past that bridge in orange and brown. On the near track, you have a South Shoreline rail car. It is stainless steel, fluted, has the orange and yellow South Shoreline logo, and it has level boarding, as well as tactile warnings. In particular, that level boarding is at a door that has the international symbol of disability. I've titled this slide, Why We Fight: Opposition to Transit and the Social Model in Action. Keep in mind that the BART story is an outlier. In most cases, the response to being sort of asked, unless you have somebody like Wilson, who I'm not usually one for great man or great person history, but occasionally you have somebody who's just really good at getting people to align and sort of becomes the champion just due to their ability to create the sort of movement and help propel other people's ideas into that public consciousness. Most of the time, people like Wilson in other systems that were not in the right place in the right time would be laughed off. Despite the fact that level boarding, which the standard for level boarding has been around for a long time. The Pennsylvania Railroad on the Northeast Corridor really set that standard back in like the late 1800s with their platforms. Not because they were thinking about disability, but because they were thinking about how can we get people on and off our trains as quickly as possible to make the most money. As it turns out, level boarding is also really good for that. And it's why things like the South Shoreline also did that. And places like the Chicago Loop also have that. And a lot of metros, which are intended to move as many people as quickly as possible, also do this. Opposition, however, usually was hinged and is hinged on two big areas: cost and quote-unquote efficiency. These really, as measures, represent the willingness to address accessibility and, more importantly, the value placed on disabled people by people in power. And that value is both sort of in absolute, i.e., do I actually think this population is worth my time and energy? But also relative, as there are a lot of other factors that add into how do we make transit accessible that, in some cases, do affect the way that people think. So I have another very text-heavy slide here, kind of breaking that down. So, in terms of cost, usually the arguments are, well, first of all, cost is often more obvious as a measure of what you're valuing. I'm spending, say, $300 million on new trains and not putting any thought into disability. Kind of shows, well, I don't actually value this audience, especially if you're doing the bare minimum. But cost often sort of centers on retrofitting existing infrastructure, things like vehicles, but also your stations and stops. There are actually standards in the ADA for what an accessible bus stop for just like the bus, the going around your city, looks like. The thing is that it costs money to do that and not just have it be a patch of grass or a sidewalk that is completely ruined. And it also costs money to put the required infrastructure on vehicles. For example, you have two systems, SEPTA and the Toronto Transit Authority. I forget what their official name is. Both of these operated what are known as PCC cars. These are streetcars that were developed in the 20s. The Canadians updated that version, as essentially it was an early version of an open source sort of everybody can use this standardized car, and that will make it cheaper to run these street railways, because 1920s you start to see these issues arise, especially as that's also when a lot of the lines were first put under one banner, and some of them were even starting to be taken over by cities themselves. SEPTA, the Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Authority. Yes, I am bad with acronyms sometimes. But they had a fleet of, from that first generation, just during the Great Depression or immediately after, those PCCs. And a couple of years ago, they actually updated them. Not because making a old sort of high floor, which high floor versus low floor, quick rundown, basically is a vehicle that has the sort of where people exist in it, say a bus or a train, above the wheels. Well, low floor is we have this very close to the ground so that the wheels may not be above. You might not be sitting completely above the wheels, more or less. There are better definitions than that, but the thing to note is that PCCs, you had to get steps into them. So SEPTA had to put in a wheelchair lift, which isn't ideal for a trolley, which is essentially a bus but on rails. And also, the actual way that it operates is another conversation for a different channel. That said, the lift isn't ideal. It requires you to stop and unfurl it, and unlike a newer low-floor system, which they announced that they were buying new ones in 2023, this is slow. But the rest of their trolley fleet, which were built in the 80s and not made accessible despite being required to, we'll come back to that. That whole fleet is really showing its age. And the new light rail trolley vehicles are not going to be in service until 2027 at the earliest. And that's assuming that everything goes on schedule. Compare that to Canada, where they looked at basically the same thing as their vehicles, and a lot of trolleys actually are based off of the original PCC design. They looked at that same situation, looked at the cost, and in 2005 basically said, well, we have 20 years before we have to be accessible. We're just going to wait till we get new vehicles and make those accessible. The sort of cost-benefit analysis was, how soon can we get this? How soon are we required to be doing this? And is it worth it for us to do this? And the Canadians made the decision that disabled people being able to use their system now was less of a priority than putting that money into the new infrastructure, even if it was possible. Now, it's also important to note that the SEPTA updates were because, we are physically in need of enough vehicles to run this because of a number of reasons that we'll come into that kind of plague a lot of American transit. But one of the biggest things is that the sort of difference there is that Toronto basically said, we're going to make sure that our new stuff is accessible, and has, for the most part, followed through on this. Part of how they were able to do that, and to sort of do a decently good job of it, is having that as a requirement from day one. The issue is that a lot of the times, new built accessible things require a change to an existing plan, not necessarily because of the fact that you couldn't have put it in the first place, but because oftentimes you'll get somebody who was making the plans who basically forgot to do it, or decided it wasn't worth the slight additional cost to, say, have it be a ramp. And going back a slide, this brand new station, the cost of the ramp that is on the left, slightly more than stairs. And I mean slightly. But the idea of looking at it from that whole system perspective of, we're updating all these stations or building a new line, while I'm usually talking about the US here, see the new Victoria line in the UK, where a lot of stations, despite having a mandate, straight up did not have elevators, despite needing them for access. You then have to go in and change existing plans, which can range from, this is just about done, to we're in the planning phase, and that adds more cost. And so there's often a grumble of, we're not going to put the money into this, or we don't think we should have to put the money into this because it will cause our cost to go higher. When the reality is, the difference between the accessible version and the inaccessible version, if you actually are thoughtful and put time into doing it right, very little is different. However, the other side of it is the efficiency argument. And this is usually a little harder to quantify as, I don't value disabled people, because it's easier to say I'm not willing to spend $100,000 on accessible things versus I don't think it's efficient to do this. One of the big cases that comes after Section 504, which again, watch Crip Camp, was basically saying, hey, paratransit is not the same as good public transit. That changes to existing plans is, however, a part of this. Because often having to go back and fix things to make them accessible, well, we then have to go through and spend the time, and it's not efficient for us at this stage of the process to implement this. I can't tell you how many times I've had, we really can't do that because we're too far along in this. When you really can, you just don't want to, because you don't want to be the one responsible for the delay. The other part is that a lot of assistive tech to get onto a vehicle does add some form of delay. Now, level boarding, really good. We'll do a whole episode on metros and rail transit and things like that, but a lot of other forms of transit, your bus, your streetcar / trolley / tram, those aren't level boarding in a lot of cases. Some cases you do have that, but not all of them. And so oftentimes, it means that you have to use some sort of doohickey to load people on. Whether that's a chairlift, which is what SEPTA has used, or whether it's, say, a kneeling bus that deploys a ramp. Both of those things still take time. And granted, in this sort of 1970s, 1980s period, you didn't have the kneeling bus thing in its own. One of the earliest kneeling buses, which, even though I don't have it in front of me, I can remember this very clearly. It's a 70s, 80s style bus, which is kneeling, but more leaning to the side. So it's sort of canted off to the right with a ramp deployed out of it. And again, this is a low floor system that really does the kneeling well. What that essentially means is that the tech first wasn't there, and then it had to be adopted. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but these delays for basically allowing people to take the same vehicle as everyone else. So like, let's say you're going to a concert and all your friends are essentially going to take the bus back or the streetcar or whatever. Well, if you're saying, oh, we aren't going to make our buses accessible because that would delay them, you're basically preventing someone from having the same experience as their friends. And basically causing them to not be able to live independently. Because then they have to go and be excluded from the rest of the group socially. The other part is that staff need to implement the supports. And I mentioned this in the paratransit episode. But paratransit is very staff and time intensive because it provides those extra supports to people who need them, which is kind of the point of paratransit, right? It's an additional level of support after making sure that everything else that you can make accessible in the general population is accessible. That said, you still need staff to, for example, in a lot of streetcars and buses, you are supposed to secure people to the accessible parking for the chair. And a staff member has to stop and do that regardless of if they're using a ramp or not, or using a lift. And then you also have to add that into your staff training for everyone. That's also why a lot of places do not do accessibility staff training as a baseline thing, because it often leads to additional time and money. And so we have it as our special once in a blue moon thing that we bring in somebody to do. This isn't everywhere, but there are plenty of places that do that. And I'm not necessarily just talking about transit there. The other part is the fear of having to go back and make a change. For a lot of people, spending $100 million on improvements to the transit system and making that decision, you're going to be afraid that somebody's going to be upset that you did the new innovative thing wrong, especially if it's an accessibility thing, and it turns out that disabled people are not exactly happy with how you implemented it. The reality is, disabled people understand that it's iterative, but this fear of doing it wrong and having your career essentially tarnished by it in a lot of cases, even if it wouldn't be, it would be, this is a learning opportunity, that ends up sort of overwhelming people and leading them to inaction. Because, well, if I get this wrong, I'm not going to go with what I expect or what I don't already know. And oftentimes, for people who are in decision-making positions, it means I'm going to use existing technology that doesn't include disabled people. The bottom line, disabled people are viewed as less valuable in society, especially up through this point around public transit. On the screen, we have a picture from the city of Chicago. We have several folks in wheelchairs in a circle in front of an elevator in, I believe, the Loop. Yep, that is the Loop. And they are protesting the fact that the CTA was essentially saying paratransit is all you get. In 1982, there was a major case that basically said you can't just do paratransit, it has to be accessible transit. Now, we also have several folks who are standing, and I am not sure if they have disabilities themselves or are just allies, but a couple of them are playing guitar. You have some folks reading. One of the people actually looks like they've installed cup holders in their wheelchair, which is cool. But this photo kind of shows that not just the fact that disabled people were less valued, because even though you have in the background the elevator that also has the international symbol of accessibility on it, they're protesting after the point where that was required. Now, the reason for this is, again, the idea that, in essence, right, rail is easier to make accessible because you can do level boarding for your metro system. Back when I said BART was doing that, the big changes that needed to be made were making those gaps smaller, were addressing things like having places for wheelchairs to exist as opposed to packing in as many seats as you can, things like that. Those are not necessarily the most difficult things to implement. The reality is that BART is just one part, or even metros or light rail or any part of transit is only one part of it. And different places have different needs and different systems. And so yes, relatively easy to make your metro train accessible, at least from the physical standpoint, but in a lot of cases, the rest of the systems were not following that. There was a lag. And what this ends up doing is causing people to need to protest. Now, this is in 1984, this photo on the screen. I don't know why it's black and white. This is from the Chicago Historical Society, or Chicago History Museum, and I'll have the link to this story in the description as well. But that view of being less valuable, even once you get wins like Section 504 and the standards, sort of mandating that you need to make this accessible, you end up with still having to fight the perception of people being less valuable. And let's get into that. So on the screen, this is from New York City. You have New York cops arresting disabled people for protesting Greyhound. And in the background, you have a Greyhound bus. In the foreground, you have a bunch of disabled people in wheelchairs who are blocking the movement of a Greyhound bus. Because Greyhound, despite having a lot of regulations and intercity buses having regulations, and subsidies from the government, they were not making their buses accessible. 504 mandated transit access, but a lot of places basically pretended to ignore it. 504 allowed the government to basically sue you and take all the money that they gave you, in the same way that the Civil Rights Act did that, and other sort of levers that the government has exist. The thing is that it has to be proven that it's a repeated offense, and it's hard to get to that standard if you're actually doing it right. So, in a lot of cases, it just wasn't done. Even though transit access was actually a part of those core standards, and one of the reasons that disabled people took over a federal building in the first place, you end up having it not take hold, at least not quickly, especially when you're looking at beyond the federal government is giving you money, we can turn this off side of things. But that fight started something. Now, there is a group of folks who are known as ADAPT. I forget what that acronym stands for in particular, but the various ADAPT groups were all about public transit, and usually centered around independent living centers. And essentially what they would go and do is go and protest directly. The reason for this is because disabled people essentially have found that in a lot of cases, we have to use the laws that exist and push for them to be implemented fairly. Oftentimes, the advocacy that is done by disabled people has been direct action. And I will put other examples in the comments and over on Patreon, where you can also find the slides and transcripts, and maybe give me money if you want. But the direct action is what spurred change. Now, this photo is actually from the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities in New York City, and is from 1997, which is after 504, but also after the ADA. And there's a reason that the ADA also actually further strengthened a lot of the transit requirements, and essentially turned up the level of, okay, this is what you're required to do as a public entity. Now, this photo is a CTA bus at Chicago Union Station, sort of driving past with a bunch of people sort of coming out of the station, and the Chicago skyline rising up and completely being the background. This is a modern low-floor kneeling bus. Now, remember, 504 was mandating transit access. The ADA turned that up to the next level and further strengthened you have to have both your stations and your vehicles. And basically, the requirement is anytime you change either of these in a significant way, for example, if you're not, say, just fixing a broken engine, you have to make that change. And so a lot of refurbishments triggered it, and while this is not an ideal situation, it takes time. Now, the ADA also, in response to some of the lawsuits that I mentioned earlier around paratransit, and specifically paratransit not being a solution to transit access, did specifically mention that paratransit only is discriminatory and that it's an auxiliary. I go into this in my episode on it, but it further pushes this idea that we need to make all public transit for everybody all the time as accessible as we can, and we also need to provide support for people who need it more. Again, that independent living perspective, that you can have that same right to be on the transit as possible so that you can make the choice of whether to use it or not without there being somebody else essentially making that choice for you because I can't get to the bus, or I can't get on the bus, or I can't get on the train has nowhere for me to sit. The other part is that the ADA had a lot more visibility than Section 504. You can actually see how far it's affected everything, in that people do not necessarily remember a world before complying with the ADA was a fact of life in a lot of cases. And more people are living their whole lives under the ADA being the standard. The visibility of it really pushed people to comply. And it also pushed for more and more organization of various groups in various cities to push for full accessible fleets. The ADA did a lot to help with this. This isn't to say that it's absolutely perfect 100% of the time, as nothing is. But I do want to get into some of that here at the end. On the screen, we are in Washington, D.C., in Noma, near Union Station. You have a accessible bus on the left in the foreground going down over a bridge, and the now defunct DC streetcar, which is actually a great example of this and what I'm about to talk about, coming up in the foreground. Context is key with any transit discussion. Accessibility, design, whatever. And oftentimes, the desire to be perfect and have your perfectly spherical exists and is right everywhere public transit system becomes the enemy of good and great. And what I mean by that is that trying so hard to do it 100% right and holding every system to the exact same standard without considering the context often leads to, well, not necessarily giving it the attention it deserves. Or you end up constantly planning and never implementing things. Sort of like what I said with the fear of being wrong. Now, the US context is important. A lot of the nationalization of public transit was to do the bare minimum. What is the least viable transit we can provide? Because as much as it is a public good and was seen and regulated as a public good, governments aren't always the happiest to be spending money on things. Despite the fact that everybody likes when you actually do it, and do it in a way that benefits people, as opposed to just funding a bunch of cops who don't do a bunch of things and just kind of stand around and don't actually make things noticeably safer. The weak point of the ADA, kind of to this end, is money. It required things to be made accessible, but didn't put together a pot of money for it itself. There were a lot of different funding revenues, or funding avenues, that came together to create this and have been around for people to utilize. But in a lot of cases, that requirement was put solely on the shoulders of the agencies that, in a lot of cases, were already significantly underfunded. If you had unlimited money, what I talked about a few slides ago, where monetary cost became one of the talking points against doing accessibility, at least from a physical standpoint, that monetary cost not being really supported ends up meaning things like, well, we have to use the less ideal system because we never implemented the perfect system we wanted to, because we didn't ever have the money to implement that. That being said, transit also has to think about the context that it exists in. Different systems will have different needs. You have different places where people live. You have different sort of historical contexts that exist. So something like the DC Metro often is viewed as being a lot better than something like the CTA and the L. And if you, the viewer, want to go and look up a map of both of these, you can see that instead of being we bring people into the central part of the city system, you have a system that is based on getting people sort of around the city. Now, there are issues with the Washington Metro's plans and things that probably should be implemented to make that even better, but the needs of the CTA to make it accessible as a system that is elevated are also going to be different than the DC Metros. And a system that is a rural transit system is going to have different needs than one that serves a major urban area, particularly with how to get people to the bus stop. There will also be different things that different systems do really well. Platform heights and boarding is a big one. You can have sort of all-level boarding and have platforms that are really well constructed and especially for if you have a system that is a historic system, might have been designed from the ground up with a level boarding system. And then you might have other systems that don't have that. Or you might have something that is a new build system where you can put that in really well. But because that system had only been running buses before, they might not hire somebody who really gets that to run the project. The other part is that different pressures will create different solutions, and the DC streetcar is a great example of that. Now, DC used to have a really, really good streetcar network. It, like many other streetcar networks, died out as cars started to take over, and the DC Metro kind of has supplanted it for a lot of the rapid transit. However, the DC streetcar as a solution, quote unquote, was something that came about, I believe, during the Obama years. And essentially, the pressures of putting in that streetcar turned it into a lot less usable, even if it is accessible. And that's a huge part of something you have to think about with transit. Accessible does not always mean accessible. And I say this in the sense of accessible from a disability standpoint doesn't always mean that it's actually usable by people, period. The stop for the streetcar is on a bridge. You have to get to the stop in the middle of this bridge, and it's not directly connected to Union Station. It's actually pretty convoluted to get there from Union Station. But the pressure of we don't want to take up too much space for cars basically led to the streetcar having this route that doesn't really serve the places where a streetcar would be the best. So it's really good at addressing high-density bus areas because you can fit more people on it. And so that pressure made it less usable, even if it was accessible. The other pressure that the US has is essentially there are requirements to buy American. Unless there is a specific reason, you can't get that from the US. So the DC streetcar used essentially a company that now is defunct, that was started as a homegrown streetcar organization, and basically they never got enough orders because requiring people to build in the US for streetcars meant that there had already been a lot of places that came over and built factories for that. Plus, they weren't really doing anything that anybody else was doing necessarily better, other than a company that was built in America as a startup to build streetcars. But because it's Washington, D.C., the pressure to buy from an American company outright, as opposed to a proven design from somewhere else, that ended up basically creating the solution to what do we put on this of not using a proven accessible design that other systems use, and instead using a brand new design that has basically caused the streetcar to fall apart. The streetcar itself was very accessible. The problem is that the context that it existed in made it so that it was not usable or accessible from that standpoint. And the same thing happens at any point. Remember what I said about the Pennsylvania Railroad and their high platform standard? That was not out of a desire for access, but it created a solution because of the pressure of needing to get people on and off the train quickly for those commuter trains. Other places just essentially put very large doors on and off. But the other thing to remember with the context of transit, and especially for accessibility, disabled people aren't a monolith, and treating what is the correct way to make transit accessible for any system as a perfectly spherical blob doesn't work. Transit systems are not monoliths either. The historical context of Chicago is very different than that of Indianapolis. Indianapolis used to have a lot of streetcars and used to have interurbans linking a lot of the outer suburbs. Chicago had the context of a lot of the trains that existed there were the heavier, quote-unquote, steam railroads. And while some of that interurban stock still survives, really you don't have that outside of a few places for Chicago. And so at the end of the day, the way that these transit systems developed was very different, because a lot of, say, the CTA and the L, that was built separated from the grade due to just being a bigger city and more densely populated. And so the solution for Indianapolis is going to be very different because of the way that the city is developed. And because of that, you end up with a light rail and then BRT system as the way that the city developed their desire to improve their transit, as opposed to saying, well, a level boarding metro would be much more accessible. Yes, it would be, but it also wouldn't necessarily make sense given the cost and the fact that, especially with the density of Indianapolis, a metro doesn't make sense here. At least not yet. I would love for that to change, but the reality is this is a context episode. Accessible transit has been a fight for years and years and years and years and years, and will continue to be one. But in the US, where, unironically, transit accessibility is some of the best in the world, and if not the best in the world, it has developed from very specific considerations and very specific historical events that pushed transit from being a private thing that was trying to make as much money as possible into the minimum funded by the government. And the same pressures that existed at the same time, in a lot of cases, pushed for a disability rights movement that has continually held transit agencies to actually improving accessibility through direct action. What that has created is a number of laws, regulations, and different areas of accessibility within specific modes of transit. That said, this has been a rather extensive episode. This is almost 2 hours of recording, so it'll probably be an hour 45, hour and a half for you to listen to. In the future, we will do an episode on accessible transit for particular modes or particular systems, but for now, this is where we're going to call it. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in our next one. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and we also aren't You'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.